or at least not meant for the world as it has been shaped today. That's not just a riddle or a dramatic opening line. It's a reality, because the Ethiopian Bible, the oldest complete Christian Bible on earth, does exactly that. It dares to tell stories that challenge what many people think they know, and it raises questions that most religious institutions would prefer never to answer. Ethiopia is more than just a country in East Africa. It is a land whose roots run deeper than many realize, a nation that has carried secrets of the ancient world while empires rose and fell around it. And within its churches, its monasteries, and its centuries of tradition, Ethiopia has guarded something the rest of the world either forgot or deliberately ignored. While Western Europe built its version of Christianity, carefully edited and reshaped to suit the politics of the time, Ethiopia quietly preserved an older tradition, a canon of texts so vast and so bold that it holds 88 books, compared to the 66 most of the world knows today. Think about that. 22 extra books, filled with stories that never made it into the Western Bible. Some of them explain the missing years of Jesus. Others tell us about fallen angels, giants, visions of the end times, and the struggle between good and evil in ways that are far sharper, far darker, and far more revealing than anything you've been told in Sunday school. These are not just add-ons. They are scriptures that could reshape how you see creation itself, how you see humanity's role on earth, and how you see the forces that have been battling for control of our world since the beginning of time. Why were these books set aside? Why was Ethiopia left to hold on to them, while the rest of the world was told a smaller, narrower version of the story? Was it a matter of control, of power, of hiding truths too dangerous to be shared? Or was it simply that Ethiopia's Christianity grew separate, untouched by the Roman Empire and its later councils that decided what was acceptable and what would be burned or banned? Whatever the answer, the result is this. The Ethiopian Bible is a time capsule, a window into a faith unedited, unsanitized, and unashamed of the mysteries that the Western world tried to bury. But let me ask you something. Why does this matter today? Why does it matter in an age where most people barely open the 66 books, let alone the 88? The answer is simple. We live in a world where truth is constantly being twisted, rewritten, or silenced. Our history books are edited, our media filters what we see, and for thousands of years, even our scriptures have been touched by the same hand. That's why looking back at the Ethiopian Bible is not just about the past. It's about the present. It's about asking what truths are still being hidden from us now, and who benefits when we stay in the dark. You see, the moment you begin reading the Ethiopian Bible, you realize it feels alive in a different way. It is filled with stories that don't just echo the familiar, they expand them. It speaks of Adam and Eve in ways that highlight the cosmic battle that began with their fall. It reveals a Jesus who is far more radical, far more connected to the oppressed, and far more divine than many modern sermons dare to say. It keeps alive books like Enoch, which describe the rebellion of angels, the birth of giants, and the corruption of humanity in vivid detail. These aren't fairy tales. They're warnings, preserved in a book that refused to bow to the erasers of history. And that's what makes Ethiopia's role so extraordinary. While nations chased wealth, conquest, and empire, Ethiopia was building monasteries in caves where monks dedicated their lives to copying these texts by hand, preserving them word for word across centuries. Imagine the patience, the sacrifice, the devotion it takes to protect something for nearly 2,000 years. That is why the Ethiopian Bible exists today in a form no one else can claim. It is the oldest complete Bible in the world, and it has stood untouched through wars, colonization, and centuries of silence from the West. But silence can only last so long. Today, these scriptures are reaching more eyes and ears than ever before, and for some, that is terrifying. Because once you start reading them, once you hear the voice of these ancient pages, you realize just how much has been kept from you. You begin to see that the Bible you were raised on, while powerful in its own right, is not the whole story. It's only a piece of the puzzle. And the Ethiopian Bible is the missing piece that makes the picture complete. Now imagine how different the world could look if these texts were not hidden. If the Book of Enoch, with its detailed description of angels who fell and corrupted humanity, had been part of the Western Bible from the start. Imagine if the lost years of Jesus, described in these texts, had been openly taught for centuries. Imagine if people had known from the beginning that their faith was never meant to be a weapon of empire, but a living fire meant to set people free. The thought alone is powerful. And maybe, just maybe, it's dangerous to those who prefer a tame faith, a faith that doesn't question, a faith that doesn't empower. That's why this story matters. That's why this documentary matters, because once you hear what the Ethiopian Bible contains, you cannot unhear it. Once you know, you cannot go back to not knowing. And that's the very definition of forbidden truth. Knowledge so powerful that the world tries to hide it. But now it's in your hands. And the question is, what will you do with it? Before we move deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it right now? Drop your name and your city in the comments. I want to know how far this truth is reaching tonight. And if you're as hungry for knowledge as I am, then I need you to do two things. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone you know. Together we can grow this community to 10,000 subscribers and beyond. If you want to support the channel directly, hit the super thanks button. It helps keep this work alive. And if you want the complete 88 Books Ethiopian Bible and the Book of Enoch in English, I've put the link in the description. Go get it for yourself, because nothing is more powerful than reading the truth with your own eyes. The land under. The hot sun of the Horn of Africa has a story that goes deeper than the dirt under its mountains. Ethiopia is more than just another country on the map of East Africa. It is a living archive of the world's oldest faith traditions and a protector of treasures that most people have long since forgotten. Ethiopia stayed strong for hundreds of years, even as empires rose and fell and conquerors tried to change history. It carried with it a legacy of faith that would not bend to outside forces. That strength and resilience is why Ethiopia is the only country in the world that still has all 88 books of the ancient Bible. Christianity did not come to Ethiopia through war, and foreign armies did not force it on the people. The Aksumite Empire, which lasted from the 1st century onward, was when it first took root. Aksum was a big deal. It was one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world, controlling trade routes across the Red Sea and having as much power as Rome, Persia, and India. Its coins, which have crosses on them, are proof of a time when faith and power came together to make one of the first Christian states. But what made Aksum stand out was not just that it accepted Christianity, but that it did so on its own terms, without Rome's help. The story starts with a man named Frumentius, who is often thought of as Ethiopia's apostle. He was taken as a child and brought to Aksum, where he worked his way up in the royal court and eventually converted the king of the empire, Ezana, to Christianity. Ethiopia's conversion to Christianity was different from many others in history that were forced by war and bloodshed. It was based on choice and conviction. The Aksumite Empire became one of the first kingdoms in the world to officially declare Christianity as its religion at that point. What came next was more than just a new chapter in faith. It was the start of a cultural identity that would last through invasions, wars, and hundreds of years of being cut off from the rest of the world. During these early years, Ethiopia started gathering and keeping the scriptures that would later make up the Ethiopian Bible. While Rome held councils to decide what should be kept and what should be thrown away, Ethiopia took in and protected writings that others had thrown away. Here is where the Book of Enoch, the Jubilees, and other writings that built on Genesis and the Gospels found a permanent home. Ethiopian monks and scribes did not think they were dangerous or wrong. They thought they were true, worth copying, worth teaching, and worth protecting at all costs. Ethiopia's ancient monasteries were safe places for these manuscripts because they were high in the mountains and hidden in caves. Monks spent their whole lives copying texts by hand, using parchment made from animal skins and inks made from natural minerals. Every stroke of the pen was a prayer, and every page was a gift. Some monasteries, like the ones in the remote area of Tigray, are built into steep cliffs, so getting to the entrance is a dangerous climb. But the fact that it is so hard to get to is what makes Ethiopian preservation so smart. The monks protected their scriptures from the fires of war and the eyes of foreign invaders by hiding their treasures in places that were hard to get to understand why Ethiopia was the only country to keep all 88 books. You need to look at its geography and its desire to stay free. Ethiopia was hard to conquer because it was between strong neighbors and had rough terrain. It was not colonized until the short Italian occupation in the 20th century, which was different from most of Africa. Even then, its culture and faith stayed the same. Ethiopia's isolation protected it for hundreds of years. The Western Church was busy with political councils, theological arguments, and imperial orders that limited the Bible to 66 books. Meanwhile, Ethiopia quietly worked on a more complete canon. Another important reason is how Ethiopians think about faith itself. They didn't see the Bible as just a way to run the country or a book to be cut down for convenience. It was sacred history, the story of how God and people have been together since the beginning of time. It was too big and too deep for people to change. Ethiopia kept stories alive that would have been lost forever if they had given up any of the writings. The fallen angels of Enoch, the details of creation found in Jubilees, the wisdom of other psalms and prayers, these were all still a part of Ethiopian life, woven into their art, their liturgy, and their sense of who they were. The monasteries weren't just places to store books. They were also places to keep memories safe. For example, Debre de Mo is on a flat-topped mountain that can only be reached by climbing a leather rope up a steep cliff. This monastery kept manuscripts safe from outside hands for hundreds of years through invasions and the passage of time. Or think about the churches in Lalibela, which were carved right out of solid rock. To this day, priests chant scriptures that most people have never heard. The Bible's forgotten books were not relics in these holy places. They were living texts that guided worship and shaped belief. It's also important to remember that Ethiopia's Jewish roots helped keep this alive. Ethiopia had a community of Jewish believers before Christianity got there. This is sometimes linked to the story of the Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon. Ethiopia had long valued Hebrew traditions and writings because of this old connection. When Christianity came, it was not a break but a continuation. Other Christian groups didn't like these books because they were too Jewish, but they were accepted here as part of the whole story. The Ethiopian canon is unique because it combines ancient Israelite and early Christian traditions. Ethiopia's independence from Western control also meant that it was never forced to follow the canon rules set by councils like Nicaea or Trent. No emperor's decree could dictate which books should be read or which should be destroyed. Instead, Ethiopian monks trusted their traditions, their teachers, and the wisdom passed down through centuries. That freedom gave them the strength to protect what others were afraid of. As time went on, this preservation became more than just a matter of faith. It became a source of national pride. The Ethiopian Bible is written in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language that has been kept alive by priests and scholars long after it stopped being spoken in daily life. In many ways, the survival of the language mirrors the survival of the scriptures themselves. They were both kept not because it was easy to do so, but because they were worth it. For generations, Ethiopians thought of themselves as the guardians of a trust that had been passed down from their ancestors. This trust linked them directly to the first followers of Christ. To this day, if you travel through Ethiopia, you can find churches that still hold manuscripts centuries old, wrapped in cloth and carried out only for special occasions. You can meet priests who have memorized large parts of the 88 books and can recite them with the same rhythm that their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. You can stand inside monasteries where candlelight still flickers across pages written on animal skin. The ink is as dark as it was when it was first put down. These aren't things you see in museums. They are living proof that a country never forgot its duty to protect hidden scriptures. Ethiopia's story as the guardian of the ancient Bible is not an accident of history. It is the result of a conscious decision of sacrifice and of unwavering faith. The Aksumite Empire might have been able to handle the pressure from other countries. When wars came to their doors, the monasteries could have stopped working. The scribes could have chosen an easier life than spending decades hunched over parchment. But they didn't. And since they didn't, people can still read the Bible as it was, with all the truths that others tried to hide. When people think of the Bible, they usually think of the 66 books that make up Western Christianity, which are neatly bound together in the same way that many other books are. For hundreds of years, though, there was a much larger collection of writings. These texts shaped the first believers and told stories of angels and giants, visions and divine wisdom, wars fought in heaven, and struggles endured on earth. Councils and church leaders later said that many of these books were dangerous, heretical, or not needed, and the pages were cut out of the Western canon. But they lived on in Ethiopia. Some of these are the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, Baruch, Tobit, Maccabees, and many others that the rest of the world forgot, but that Ethiopian priests and scribes never forgot. The Book of Enoch is a great example of this split. It's quoted in the New Testament letter of Jude and was well known among the first Christians. It has visions of heavenly realms, descriptions of angelic beings, and the story of the Watchers, angels who came to earth, married human women, and had the Nephilim, a race of giants. This story builds on the strange verses in Genesis that hint at things like this happening. It gives voice to a tradition that explains where evil and corruption come from on earth. For early believers, Enoch was not a story of fantasy, but a revelation of spiritual warfare. But as the years went by, church leaders in the West became less comfortable with its detailed accounts of fallen angels and otherworldly beings. If it were true, it would make people question human history and divine judgment, which would go against the neat order that the councils wanted to create. So Enoch was quiet in the West, but in Ethiopia, it was still a key part of faith. The Ethiopian tradition also holds the Book of Jubilees in high regard. Some people call it Little Genesis because it tells the stories of creation, the flood, and the patriarchs in great detail. It breaks history up into 49-year cycles called Jubilees, which show how God's patterns of time shape human history. It talks about angels being involved in the events of Genesis and gives a view that focuses on covenant, obedience, and the cosmic significance of what people do. People in the West called this book too Jewish, too tied to the old ways, and threw it away. In Ethiopia, where Hebrew roots and Christian faith came together, Jubilees was loved as sacred truth instead of being thrown away as a bother. Baruch, a book that has to do with the prophet Jeremiah, as prayers of confession and pleas for mercy for people who are in exile. The words are raw and strong, and they sound like the struggles of people who were destroyed or taken prisoner. In Western Christianity, Baruch was often seen as an extra, something less important. But in Ethiopia, it was read as part of the conversation between God and his people. It was a reminder that prayer could move heaven even when things were bad. The Book of Tobit adds something else. It is a story about faith, family, and God stepping in. Tobit, A good man who has bad luck sends his son on a journey that turns into a story of angels, demons, and healing. The archangel Raphael shows up to guide and protect, and themes of marriage, loyalty, and God's care come to light. The Western Church thought Tobit was good for teaching morality, but they didn't think it was inspired enough to be part of their final canon. For Ethiopia, it was proof that God is very involved in the lives of his people, even in the everyday problems of sickness and family. The Maccabees books contain another layer of truth that the West found hard to accept. They tell stories of the Jewish revolt against Greek oppressors, as well as stories of faith, resistance, and martyrdom. These books stress how God saved his people, because they were brave and willing to stand up to tyranny. Some of these texts stayed in Catholic Bibles, but Protestant reformers later threw them away, calling them secondary. Ethiopia, on the other hand, kept them all, honoring the blood of martyrs and the strength of those who fought to keep their faith alive. What made these books seem dangerous? Control is part of the answer. The early church in Rome and later councils wanted everyone to be on the same page, but their idea of unity meant only using Bible passages that supported their political and theological goals. People thought books that told too much about angels, demons, and battles in space were scary. Writings that linked Christianity too closely to Jewish tradition were seen as a danger to a faith that wanted to separate itself from its roots. Stories that gave regular people the strength to fight back against oppression could make people want to stand up to religious and political leaders. To keep these voices quiet was to keep power, which is why the Western canon got smaller. Ethiopia's canon, on the other hand, shows a different picture. By including all 88 books, Ethiopia kept a more complete picture of how people have interacted with God. Ethiopia didn't cut out the mystical, the supernatural, or the raw cries of human suffering. Instead, they welcome them. Their Bible doesn't show a neatly polished faith. Instead, it shows a living, breathing fight between heaven and earth, light and darkness, hope and despair. In it, God's story is huge and complicated. It is not limited by the choices that people make in councils that are far away from the original witnesses. It's not just the numbers that make Ethiopia's canon different from the Western canon. It's a difference in how people see the world. The 66 books of the Western Bible tell a simple story of creation, covenant, redemption, and revelation. It is organized, short, and the result of hundreds of years of debate and compromise. The Ethiopian Bible has 88 books, but it tells a bigger story that can't be contained. It talks about secrets in heaven, angels walking among people, divine patterns that shape time, prayers that rise from the ashes of exile, angels fighting demons, and God guiding his people in both miraculous and personal ways. People who only know the Western canon might feel like they are opening a door to a whole new world when they read the Ethiopian Bible. The thunderous stories of Enoch suddenly break the silence around Genesis 6. Jubilees changes the way history flows. The bravery of faith is even stronger in the deaths of the Maccabees. Tobit makes it easier to see how close God's care is. The Western Bible is not false. It is merely incomplete, lacking certain chapters in its narrative. Truth has often been hidden throughout history when it threatens the power structures. The Bible's banned books are no different. Rome said they were too dangerous, but Ethiopia welcomed them because they were too important to lose. Because of this, the Ethiopian Bible is still a living proof that truth can't be destroyed, only hidden. That is, until someone is brave enough to look where others told them not to. Enoch's story is different from all the other stories in ancient religious texts. The Western Bible only gives a short look at this mysterious man, but the Ethiopian tradition has a whole book about his visions, meetings with heavenly beings, and warnings to people. The text takes the reader on a journey beyond the limits of the earth, where angels take Enoch to places that have never been seen before, to the very structure of the universe as it was understood thousands of years ago. He is not just watching, Instead, he becomes a witness, a keeper of secrets that only he can see in the heavens. He is a man chosen because he is good and close to God. He sees God's throne, the armies of angels, and the great order that keeps everything in the universe together in these passages. It seems like he is being given the chance to look behind the veil that keeps spiritual reality hidden from most people. The stories of the Watchers, angels who came to earth with a purpose that started out as curiosity but quickly turned into rebellion, are some of the most shocking things in the book. The story says that these angels did not stay in their heavenly homes, but instead married human women, which was a line that was never meant to be crossed. Their actions led to the birth of the Nephilim, a race of giants whose strength and hunger threatened the very balance of creation. These beings were more than just tall men or legendary warriors. They were a mix of heaven and earth that changed the natural order. People in the past would have seen them as more than just big people. They would have seen them as symbols of pride that can't be controlled and knowledge that shouldn't be known. They would have been a warning of what happens when divine limits are ignored. The Nephilim, who were born from this strange union, spread violence all over the world. They fought wars, taught people forbidden arts, and used up resources because they were always hungry. The text says that they were destroyers, beings whose very presence caused destruction on earth. This corruption wasn't just physical, it was also spiritual. The Watchers, who used to be messengers of light, started to teach people how to do magic, make weapons, read the stars, and even change the world. For a society that valued balance and harmony, these teachings were nothing short of an attack on divine order. People were being given knowledge that was too dangerous for them to use, and the world was falling apart as a result. Angels lead Enoch to be the one to intercede. The fallen Watchers themselves ask him to write a letter to the Most High, asking for forgiveness. They know their actions have broken eternal laws, but they still hold out hope that mercy might reach them. But the answer Enoch gets to bring back is harsh and final. Their sin can't be undone. The Watchers will be judged, and the Nephilim, their children, will die in the flood. The punishment is not the only amazing thing about this passage. The text also makes it very clear where evil comes from in the world. Western scriptures frequently depict evil as an enigmatic entity lacking clarification. However, in the Ethiopian preserved Book of Enoch, it possesses an origin, a narrative, and a lineage. One of the most interesting things about Enoch's visions is the journey he takes through space. He's taken through levels of heaven and shown the wind's storehouses, the stars' treasuries, and the sun and moon's chambers. He sees how creation is organized and kept up, not in vague spiritual terms, but in a kind of cosmic geography. The early church fathers talked about what these revelations meant because they were so detailed and deep. People who read them felt like the secrets of the universe had been revealed. For some, this was a source of inspiration. For others, it was dangerous knowledge that could cause believers to focus more on hidden mysteries than on established doctrine. Western leaders threw the book away because of this very danger. The organized church couldn't handle the story of angels going against heaven, people getting forbidden knowledge, and cosmic structures that make simple theology seem wrong. The Western canon, which was based on keeping beliefs and power the same, could not let this kind of text spread freely. If people who believe in angels and demons started to ask questions about angels having sex with people, hidden realms of creation, and the origins of giants and demons, then the authority of church tradition would be weakened. The church made sure that its version of the story, the shorter, safer one, would win by silencing Enoch's voice. But the book lived on in Ethiopia. It was copied in monasteries, read with other holy books, and treated as holy. It continued to shape how Ethiopians thought about the universe. In that place, Enoch was not an ancestor who had been forgotten. He was a prophet whose revelations explained why the world was broken, why judgment was necessary, and why divine order must always be preserved. The Ethiopian Bible didn't shy away from these cosmic truths. Instead, it included them in the larger story of how humans have always fought between light and darkness. Enoch's writings resonate with contemporary readers as they reflect enduring inquiries that persistently trouble us. What is the source of evil? Why do the powerful so often make the world worse? What are the forces that shape history that we can't see? The Book of Enoch doesn't shy away from these questions. Instead, it directly addresses them with a story that shows how corruption started with rebellion in the heavens and forbidden unions. It implies that the issues confronting the world are not solely human, but cosmic in nature, originating from ancient celestial conflicts. And maybe this is why the book was thought to be too dangerous for the West. It does not depict evil as accidental or merely symbolic. Rather, it portrays it as a direct result of entities that were aware of the truth and opted to oppose it. It makes the believer realize that the problems of people are linked to bigger problems that go beyond the physical. This makes it easier to understand history, spirituality, and human weakness in a way that is much more disturbing than what you find in the cleaned-up versions of Scripture. That troubling truth, though, was still there in Ethiopia. It was kept as part of the story to remind people that faith isn't just about comfort. It's also about facing truths that could shake what we think we know. The Book of Enoch tells the stories of angels, giants, hidden heavens, and a brave prophet who wrote them all down. It shows the clash of heaven and earth. The Book of Jubilees is one of the most interesting books in the Ethiopian canon, and it completely changes how we think about where people came from. Many people know the story of Adam and Eve from Genesis, but Jubilees tells it again in a way that gives a very different view. Jubilees doesn't tell a simple, flowing story of creation, fall, and the generations that came after. Instead, it organizes history in a very clear way. It breaks time down into exact periods, giving us a kind of divine calendar that shows us not only what happened, but also when it was supposed to happen. In doing this, it puts human history in the context of a larger cosmic order, where every moment is already known, counted, and measured. The story of Adam and Eve in Jubilees is both familiar and strange. The placement of Adam and Eve in the garden is described in more detail. Their expulsion is given more information, and their children's roles are expanded in ways that are not seen in Genesis. It tells you what they did and why it mattered in the grand scheme of things. For example, Cain and Abel are not just the sad brothers who made different sacrifices. In Jubilees, their story is part of a bigger story about following God's laws. Cain's murder is not just an act of jealousy. It is a violation of the divine order. The book's main idea is that what people do affects not only the world around them, but also the balance of the universe. This brings us to one of the main ideas in Jubilees, the holiness of time. Jubilees, on the other hand, says that God made a calendar of weeks, months, and years, while Genesis just tells the story of creation over 7 days. It breaks history up into Jubilees, which are 49-year periods that follow the same pattern as the Sabbath week, but on a cosmic scale. This means that creation rests and renews on the bigger cycles of time, just like people do on the seventh day. The book proposes that the universe functions as a divine calendar, with humanity's obligation to exist in accordance with its rhythms. This calendar also changes how the festivals and holy days are used. Jubilees stresses that the feasts, like Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Day of Atonement, are not things that people made up later, but are part of creation itself. The text says that the angels in heaven already celebrated these holy days before people were made. This means that when people celebrate the festivals, they are not just following cultural norms. They are also following the eternal order of heaven. Time itself becomes holy, and each generation is judged by how well they followed or broke this divine order. It's not hard to see that Jubilees rewrote Genesis. It often fills in the blanks, adds details, and even changes the meaning of the original story. For instance, The story of the Watchers, which Genesis only hints at in chapter 6, is fully fleshed out. In more detail, Jubilees tells how heavenly beings came down to earth, married women, and had children who became the Nephilim. This supports the idea that sin and corruption were not just caused by human weakness, but were also part of a cosmic rebellion that affected human history. Jubilees links the fall of man with the fall of angels by weaving this into the story of Adam and Eve's descendants. This shows that both heaven and earth were involved in the great disruption of creation's order. Jubilees also cares a lot about genealogy. It not only lists names, but also the years of birth, the holidays celebrated, and the holy moments that defined each generation. This fixation on detail shows that people don't think history is random. Every child born and every event that occurred conformed to the divine plan. By knowing the dates and times, believers could see how their own lives were connected to the stories of their ancestors. This was more than just history. It was a reminder that they were part of a living covenant that went all the way back to Adam and not just Abraham or Moses. Another big difference is how Jubilees talks about giving the law. In the West, people think that Moses started the law at Sinai, but in Jubilees, the law has always been there, even before creation. Angels were already following God's rules and keeping the Sabbath and the festivals long before Moses got the tablets. When the law is given to Israel, it is not a new thing. It is a return to what was always meant to be. This changes how people who believe see obedience. It's not just about following rules. It's about getting back into the eternal rhythm of creation. The Book of Jubilees also gives the patriarchs more power. People like Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are not only seen as the fathers of the faith, but also as the people who keep this holy calendar. They are shown as people who celebrate holidays, keep the Sabbath, and teach their kids to live in harmony with the order of heaven. This new version of history makes them more than just wanderers or leaders. They become priests of time itself, leading people back into covenant by following sacred cycles. This view of history changes everything about how you read Genesis. Sometimes Genesis in the Western Bible seems like a bunch of stories that don't really fit together. Jubilees, on the other hand, puts all of those stories into one timeline that is based on divine order. The creation of Adam, the fall, the flood, and the covenant with Abraham all fit into a carefully planned calendar. This shows that history has never been random. It has always been planned. It is even more surprising that Jubilees says that Moses was given it on Mount Sinai. The text says that Moses not only got the 10 Commandments, but also a vision of the whole history of the world, which was broken up into Jubilees. The angels told him how creation happened, how time was split up, and how Israel's role fit into the plan that would last forever. This point of view gives the book an authority that rivals Genesis itself. It doesn't just tell the story again. It presents itself as the true version, the one that most people don't know about, but the chosen people do. This was a risk for the Western Church. If you accept Jubilees, you are saying that the law and festivals are not just temporary things, but things that will last forever. It would mean that the shorter, less detailed Genesis was not complete, and that the Ethiopian tradition had a more accurate version of how humans came to be. It would go against the idea that Christianity replaced the law, and instead show that heaven itself never stopped following it. This is one of the reasons why the Western canon didn't accept Jubilees. It just put too much emphasis on the laws, the holidays, and the power of Israel's covenant. But in Ethiopia, it was still very important. The Ethiopian Bible, which has 88 books, didn't see Jubilees as a threat. Instead, it accepted it as truth. People there still read the story of Adam and Eve as part of a divine calendar that still had an effect on their lives. They believed that every festival, Sabbath, and sacred observance brought them closer to the original order of creation. The same rhythm that angels had kept since the beginning. The Book of Jubilees compels us to contemplate a significant inquiry. What if Genesis, as commonly understood, does not encompass the entire narrative. What if the real beginnings of people, the fall, and the way history has played out were kept in the Ethiopian canon instead of the Western one? People who read Jubilees see the world as a place of order, not chaos. Time itself becomes sacred, and every action taken by humans either upsets or restores the divine balance. It is a rewriting of creation that doesn't erase the old story, but shows the deeper truth that is hidden in it. The Ethiopian texts speak with a voice that is often silenced in Western traditions. This voice says that Africa is not a forgotten part of the world, but a chosen land. These old books contain prophecies about a kingdom rising from the south, which means that Africa is at the center of God's plan for humanity. People who have only heard history from European or Middle Eastern points of view might be surprised by this idea. But for hundreds of years, Ethiopians have kept traditions that show how they helped restore both politics and religion. These prophecies were not vague. They were full of hope, identity, and divine promise, and they struck a chord with generations who believed that their land would one day be a light in a world full of oppression. The story starts with the idea that Ethiopia wasn't just a part of biblical history. It was an active part of it. The Ethiopian canon contains books that support this role by connecting the descendants of Cush, Sheba, and other African peoples to God's plan as it unfolds. Prophecies say that a kingdom would rise from the south based on righteousness, with leaders who followed the divine law and protected faith when others had gone astray. This vision is strong because it goes against the common idea that Africa got religion and civilization from other places. Instead, it sees Africa as the place where new things begin, a place chosen to keep truths that others have left behind. The prophecies used symbols a lot, like saying that rulers would come from the land of Cush and that Zion would be safe in Ethiopia. Some of these visions linked the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia, implying that God's throne was located there. Some people talked about kings who would come not with huge armies or huge empires, but with spiritual power that would make nations bow down. The idea was clear. The South would not only be a place on the map, but it would also be the beginning of a new spiritual order. What makes these prophecies so interesting is how they connect Africa's political future with its spiritual calling. They don't separate the sacred from the earthly. Instead, they show kingship as a divine calling. In the South, a king was not just a ruler. He was also a servant of God who had to keep his promises to uphold truth and justice. This shows a very different way of looking at the world than Western empires, where being a king was often linked to power, conquest, and control. In the Ethiopian vision, the Black Kingdom would ascend not through exploitation, but through adherence to God's commandments. This merging of spiritual and political identity can be seen in Ethiopian history. The Aksumite Empire, one of the first Christian nations in the world, thought of itself as more than just a political power. Kings often called themselves servants of the Almighty, protectors of the faith, and heirs to a promise from God. Ancient writings and records show how they saw their duty as not only leading their people, but also protecting a promise that went back to biblical times. The Ethiopian Church kept manuscripts that strengthened this identity, reminding each generation that they were part of a bigger plan that had been foretold long ago. The idea of a growing kingdom in the south also went against Western power, which could be why it was erased or ignored. If Africa were recognized as integral to God's plan, the colonial narrative depicting Africa as regressive and reliant would disintegrate. Western Christianity, which spread around the world through missions and wars, had a hard time accepting the idea that Africa already had the whole truth in its own scriptures and traditions. To say this would mean admitting that the Ethiopian canon, which has 88 books, showed a fuller picture of God's kingdom than the shortened Western Bible. It would mean that the story of salvation didn't start in Rome, London, or Paris, But in the highlands of Ethiopia, this deletion was not unintentional. Many Western scholars thought that Ethiopian texts were fake, strange, or not important when they first saw them. They called the prophecies of a Black Kingdom a myth instead of history, which effectively silenced voices that had been around for hundreds of years. The Ethiopian view didn't fit with the idea of European superiority, so it was pushed to the side. But the prophecies lived on in Ethiopia, passed down through liturgy, oral tradition, and the unshakable belief that their land was chosen for a reason that outsiders couldn't understand. The image of the kingdom rising from the south is also very similar to what the Bible says will happen. Isaiah, Psalms, and even Revelation talk about Cush and other nations that live beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. This suggests that they will have a role in God's plan for the future. In Ethiopian interpretation, these were not vague references, but clear statements of their fate. They thought their land was the ends of the earth, where God's name would be heard. This belief helped Ethiopians stay strong through hundreds of years of trouble. Invasions from other countries, and pressure to do what outside powers wanted them to do. In this vision, Africa has a very important spiritual role. It's not just about being a leader, it's also about keeping things safe. These traditions say that Africa kept God's full truth safe when other countries turned away from it. This is shown by the fact that the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, and other banned texts have been kept. While Western powers argued about what should be in the canon, Ethiopia quietly kept all of the scriptures. This act of preservation was a fulfillment of prophecy. The South was not making up the truth, but protecting it for the world. This vision changed the way people thought about power in politics. It said that real power doesn't come from control, but from being in line with God's will. The Black Kingdom's prophecy said that faithfulness would bring lasting strength in a world where empires rose and fell through war. This was a very radical message, especially when you think about how Europe colonized the Americas and the slave trade across the Atlantic. As Africa was being torn apart, its ancient texts said that it was meant to be a spiritual leader, not a slave. This prophecy was not only about the future for Ethiopians, but also about who they are right now. It confirmed their place in history, their promise to God, and their duty to follow God's laws. It gave people hope when they were feeling down, inspired them to fight against foreign rule, and made them proud of their culture. These prophecies still have meaning for African people all over the world, whether they live on the continent or in the diaspora. They say that Africa's story has been told wrong, and that there is a destiny that no empire could destroy. Hidden beneath centuries of erasure, the omission of this perspective in Western education illustrates significant aspects of historical politics. What is left out of a story is just as important as what is included. Western tradition centered itself and silenced Africa by getting rid of the prophecies of the Black Kingdom. But the fact that these texts are still around in Ethiopia shows a deeper truth. History can't be changed forever. The words of the prophets are still there, waiting for someone to hear them. The kingdom from the south was never meant to be a far-off dream. It was a vision based on the Bible, history, and the faith of a group of people who thought they were chosen. Its strength comes from not only being able to guess what will happen next, but also from changing how we think about the past and the present. We start to see Africa not as a forgotten place, but as an important part of the divine story that is still going on by putting these prophecies back where they belong. The Ethiopian traditions about Jesus' youth have a mysterious weight that few people outside of Africa have ever really felt. In Western stories, Jesus' life seems to jump from his miraculous birth to a short time in the temple when he was 12 years old, and then suddenly to his baptism when he was about 30 years old. For almost 20 years, there is no record, and scholars have called these missing years the lost years of Jesus. But Ethiopia and other African cultures whisper stories that fill in those gaps, keeping bits of his childhood and youth that never made it into the Western canon. These stories show not only how a child becomes a man, but also how deeply Africa, its people, and its spiritual landscape have shaped a young soul. The Ethiopian view says that Jesus' childhood can't be separated from Africa, especially Egypt, where his family fled to escape Herod's cruel order. This trip is more than just a way to get away from where you are. In African tradition, it is seen as a pilgrimage that shapes who you are. The baby Jesus was brought to the lands of Cush and Kemet, which were already full of ancient knowledge and divine mystery. Ethiopia, as the keeper of hidden scriptures, connects itself to this story by making it clear that Africa protected the Messiah when the rest of the world wanted to kill him. For Ethiopians, this is not a small thing. It is a sacred bond that will tie their land to Christ's life and mission forever. The Ethiopian manuscripts and oral tradition tell stories about the Holy Family's time in Africa that show it was not just a short stay, but a time of growth and safety. There are still villages and holy sites in Egypt and Ethiopia that say the child Jesus visited them. Monasteries keep alive stories about how the young Messiah walked on their land, drank from their wells, and stayed with them. Even now, pilgrims in Ethiopia point to old caves, springs and shrines that bear his name, connecting their faith to a direct memory of his presence. These African stories also talk about a boy who was very smart for his age and amazed even the smartest people when he was very young. The Western Gospels suggest this in the story of Jesus in the temple, where he amazed teachers with how much he knew at the age of 12. Ethiopian accounts add to this by showing Jesus as someone who learned from both God and the rich culture of the area around him. He was not cut off from people and lived alone. Instead, he was surrounded by the rhythms of African life. He heard farmers' songs, saw caravans pass with their goods, and lived in a world where Jewish, African, and Eastern cultures mixed. The lost years become even more interesting when we think about how Jesus might have learned from the wisdom traditions that are still alive in Africa. Ancient texts, philosophies, and mysteries thrived in Ethiopia, Egypt, and Nubia. Africa had a lot of knowledge that Western history often ignores, from astronomy to medicine, from sacred calendars to the legacy of prophets like Enoch. If the young Jesus was exposed to these customs, it might help explain why he taught so much later in life. When he talked about nature, justice, and divine order in parables, maybe African wisdom was already in his voice. The omission of these years from Western texts is significant. By leaving Africa out of the story of Jesus' youth, Western Christianity made an image of Christ that had nothing to do with black people or places. It made up a story in which Europe and the Middle East were the main characters, and Africa was pushed to the side as unimportant. But this silence is not acceptable in Ethiopian culture. Instead, it boldly says that the Son of God grew up under African skies, on African soil, and in African arms. Some Ethiopian texts propose that Jesus' lost years were not completely concealed from the faithful, but were deliberately preserved in texts omitted from Western Bibles. The Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, and other texts that stayed in Ethiopia stress how important Africa is to sacred history. They create a worldview in which divine encounters and revelations are not limited to a single region, but extend across the Nile, the Axum highlands, and the Egyptian deserts. This wider view of sacred geography makes Africa essential for understanding the whole life of Christ. The spiritual importance of the lost years is beyond words. If Jesus spent his early years in Africa, then Africa was not just a safe place for him to grow up. It was also a place where he learned. He was raised not only by Joseph and Mary, but also by African culture and traditions. His ministry was marked by humility, compassion, and justice. Living among people who knew the weight of empire, oppression, and faithfulness against all odds may have made these qualities even stronger. The relationship between Jesus and Africa is now one of shared fate, not just geography. The Ethiopian canon, by keeping stories of Jesus' youth, brings back a truth that Western editing has erased for hundreds of years. It pushes people who believe to think of the Messiah as being tied to Africa instead of being far away. This isn't just about getting the history right for Ethiopians and Africans in general. It's also about their identity and dignity. To acknowledge that the Savior traversed their lands, flourished among their people, and bore their dust upon his feet is to recognize that Africa has perpetually been integral to the divine narrative. It also seems like these lost years were purposely hidden from Western texts. Why would they leave out such a big part of Jesus' life? Some say it was because adding Africa changed the story of European and Middle Eastern dominance. Some people think that the secrets of his youth were too deep for most people to understand, and were only kept in the secret books that Ethiopia protected. No matter what the reason, the silence in Western Bibles only adds to the mystery and makes people want to look to Africa for answers. The lost years also connect the human and divine. In the life of Jesus, they remind us that he didn't just show up as a teacher and miracle worker. He also went through the normal struggles of growing up, learning, and staying alive. He would have felt the warmth of family, the pain of being exiled, and the strength of a people who had lived through empire after empire in Africa. These events helped him become more wise and compassionate, which he used in his ministry. He spoke as someone who had lived among the oppressed, healed the broken, and talked about how God's kingdom belongs to the meek since he was a child. In this light, the Ethiopian traditions do more than just fill in the blanks in history. They change what it means for the Messiah to be a human being. They show us a Jesus who was shaped by the culture and suffering of Africa, not someone who grew up in a bubble. His divine mission was not separate from history. It was part of it. Africa played such an important role that its absence from Western texts says a lot about whose voices were silenced. The secret childhood and lost years of Jesus are still a mystery, but Ethiopia hasn't forgotten about them. Through its manuscripts, monasteries, and oral traditions, it still says that Africa has always been a part of the Messiah's story. And by doing this, it asks the world to look beyond the familiar pages of Western Bibles and find a Christ whose life was bigger, deeper, and more connected to the story of all people than most people have ever thought. The Tower of Babel story is one of the most well-known stories in the Bible. However, when you read the Ethiopian scriptures, the details come out in ways that are different from the common version taught in Western traditions. The story is simple in the Western canon. People from all over the world try to build a tower that reaches the heavens, but God comes down and confuses their language to scatter them. It is a warning about how arrogant people can be, showing how people who try to be like gods are punished. But Ethiopia's holy books don't tell the story in such a straightforward way. From their point of view, the story is not only more complex, but also very disturbing, because it involves powers that go beyond human pride, powers connected to giants, watchers, and the corruption that spread after Eden. The Ethiopian version of the Tower of Babel is not just about people's desire to build it. It is also about the lasting effects of beings who shouldn't have been there. Long before the flood, the giants, the Nephilim, who were born from forbidden unions between heavenly watchers and human women, had left their mark on the earth. The flood was supposed to wipe them out, but Ethiopian writings say that some of their legacy lived on in bloodlines and secret knowledge that was passed down. When the Watchers taught people about architecture, math, and magic, they changed the way people thought about these things when they came together to build the tower. The tower was not just built by people. It was also inspired by forbidden knowledge, which was a sign of the angels' own rebellion. Western readers may be astonished by the vivid depiction of this moment in the Ethiopian scriptures. The tower is not just a monument to human pride. It is also a continuation of the war against heaven. The builders didn't just want to work together for safety or progress. They wanted to break through the heavens, challenge God's throne, and even set up a new order with the help of evil spirits. Ethiopian accounts say that the project had both earthly and spiritual supporters. They also say that the huge number of workers were guided by whispers of ancient giants who had great strength and knowledge. The story of Babel is directly related to the chaotic world before the flood, showing that even after judgment, rebellion could rise again. The punishment in the Ethiopian version is also more serious. In the Western canon, the confusion of languages is just a way for God to scatter people and stop their work. But Ethiopia's holy books talk about a much more planned and scary act of divine judgment. People think that the division of tongues is a breaking of bonds and a breaking of unity that could have led to another fall of humanity into total corruption. The scattering was not just to stop human pride. It was also to stop the fallen watchers from building a bridge back to the human race. Every language became a wall that kept people from working together to rebel against heaven again. From this point of view, the confusion of tongues was not a curse, but a blessing, saving people from destruction by cutting them off from the forbidden knowledge that had already caused trouble in the past. Another important difference is how Nimrod is shown, since he is often thought to be the head of the Babel project. In Western teaching, Nimrod is remembered as a powerful hunter and the man who built great cities. His name suggests that he was arrogant, but the Ethiopian version puts more emphasis on his link to the legacy of giants. People thought that Nimrod's strength, charm, and authority were not just human gifts. They were also signs of Nephilim power running through his bloodline. He wasn't building the tower out of innocent ambition. He wanted to bring back the giant's power and openly defy God. This picture of Nimrod puts him in the same category as other great rebels in history, showing that he was influenced by things that happened long before his time. The Ethiopian scriptures also talk about what happened to the nations after they were scattered. The Western canon discusses how the division of languages causes nations to spread out, but not much is said about the spiritual effects. Ethiopian texts, on the other hand, say that the spiritual destinies of nations are directly linked to their origins. Some groups were thought to have the power of the Watchers and giants, while others stayed closer to the divine order. So the scattering of nations became a spiritual sorting as well as a geographical one. It elucidates why certain populations retained vestiges of ancient paganism and idol worship originating from pre-flood corruption, whereas others maintained more untainted traditions of faith. From an Ethiopian point of view, Babel is not only the place where languages began to differ, but also the place where spiritual wars that changed the course of history began. The very building of the tower has meaning in Ethiopian texts. It wasn't just about how tall it was. It was also about getting into the places that God and his angels owned. The builders used stone and tar in ways that stood for defiance and permanence. They tried to make something that could survive even another flood. They wanted to be remembered forever and never judged. This fact shows that they were not only going against God's authority, but also his mercy, because they tried to protect themselves from the hand that had saved Noah and his family. The tower, in this light, is a monument to distrust, built on a base of fear and rebellion. The Ethiopian version also talks about how God intervened in more than just language. The Western text says that God made people speak in a way that was confusing, while Ethiopian texts say that angels were sent to take down the tower, scattering stones and shaking its base. Some stories even say that fire or thunder came down on it, which was a clear sign that heaven would not be challenged. The tower was destroyed in both a physical and spiritual way, making sure that it could not be a beacon for future uprisings. This story is directly related to earlier themes of heavenly warfare. It shows that the fight between angels and rebellious powers didn't end with the flood. It went on for generations after. The Ethiopian scriptures give readers a serious thought. Babel was not only a story of division, but also a warning of what happens when people forget what they learned in the past. The corruption that started with the Watchers grew with the giants and almost destroyed the world before the flood came back in the unity of Babel. God didn't destroy all of humanity. Instead, he protected them by breaking up their unity. But in doing so, he also made it possible for the many nations, cultures, and languages we have today to exist. Western traditions often see this as a punishment, but Ethiopia shows it as both judgment and grace, making sure that people will survive while keeping the forbidden knowledge of the giants from corrupting the earth. Again, the Ethiopian scriptures contain narratives that reveal the distinction between the visible and the invisible, highlighting a realm where angels and demons are not mere symbols, but active entities involved in a primordial struggle. In these texts, the fight between light and dark is not just a metaphor for good and evil. It is a real war that takes place in heaven, on earth, and even in the hearts of people. The war started long before people lived on earth, but the Ethiopian writings say that people are not just watching. Instead, every soul, every choice, and every prayer becomes a battleground where the fight between angels and demons goes on. The story usually starts with the Watchers, heavenly beings who were made to serve the divine order but got tired of it. The Book of Enoch, which is very important to Ethiopia, tells the story of a group of these beings who came to earth because they were attracted to the beauty of women. They broke the barrier between heaven and earth, took wives for themselves, and taught people things that weren't meant for them. The knowledge they gave about weapons, magic, and forbidden arts didn't make people better. It made them worse, causing bloodshed, sorcery, and oppression. Their kids, the giants, grew up to be tyrants who ate everything in their path and caused chaos throughout creation with their violence. This was the Ethiopian texts vividly depict the archangel's role in this cosmic conflict. Michael, the warrior prince of heaven, is shown as the leader of the angelic armies and the eternal protector of people. Raphael, whose name means God heals, is said to be the one who ties up Azazel, the great corrupter, and throws him into darkness until the day of judgment. Gabriel, who brings God's messages, has to kill the strong and quiet the giants. Uriel, the angel of wisdom and light, tells Enoch the secrets of the heavens so that this battle's truth will never be lost. In the Ethiopia, these archangels are not far-off beings from myth. They are still guardians, fighting against corrupt forces that want to eat the human soul. The fallen ones stand against them, led by people whose names are both scary and mysterious. Zemjaza, who is often remembered as the leader of the Watchers, is shown as the one who got 200 angels to come down to Mount Hermon and make their fateful deal. Azazel, one of the other great corruptors, is known for teaching men how to make swords and armor, which led to wars that never ended between nations. These fallen ones taught people about spells, cutting roots, and how to use creation for their own selfish ends. They didn't just rebel against heaven, they also rebelled against the harmony of creation itself. Their influence can still be felt in the shadows, long after the flood swept their giants from the earth. Demons, which are thought to be the restless souls of dead giants, roam the world in pain, trying to hurt people, whispering into their hearts and causing chaos wherever they go. What makes the Ethiopian view unique is how clearly it shows how people are involved in this fight. People aren't just pieces in a cosmic game. They are active players whose decisions change the game. When people choose to do the right thing, they join the archangels and make the light stronger. When they give in to greed, pride, or violence, they let the fallen ones take over and let demons get deeper into the world. The scriptures say that the enemy wants to take people away from their Creator, and that angels work hard to protect, heal, and lead people back to the truth. The Ethiopian texts provide additional details about the weapons used in this hidden war. Prayer is not shown as a ritual, but as a weapon that hurts the enemy. People think of fasting as a kind of armor that protects them from evil spirits. Acts of mercy and justice are depicted as assaults on the kingdom of darkness. The scriptures show that the battlefield is not only in the heavens, but also in the smallest things people do every day. Every good deed, every act of faith, and every word of truth adds to the fight between angels. People who walk in faith are said to be strengthened by the archangels, and demons are said to scatter when they see a heart that is turned toward God. But the war is not without its horrors. The writings talk about demons that want to strangle people in despair, addiction, or rage. They tell kings lies that lead to war and death. They hurt families by breaking them apart, turning love into hate and unity into conflict. Ethiopian monks wrote about meeting these spirits and how they would press against their cells at night, only to run away when the name of God was spoken. They kept these texts safe in their monasteries. These stories remind people that the war is real and not far away, and that they need to be careful to stay on the side of light. The Ethiopian scriptures also give hope, because they say that the archangels are not tired and that heaven will win in the end. The binding of the fallen ones, the judgment that awaits them, and the promise of their final destruction are all things that come up over and over again. The writings say that angels still protect nations, families, and people, fighting against the dark forces that want to take them over. This promise makes the cosmic battle real for each person, reminding them that they are never alone in their struggles. Every prayer adds to the chorus of resistance, and every step toward doing the right thing makes the heavenly armies stronger. The story of this great battle also shows why people often feel torn between good and evil, why temptation is so strong, and why corruption spreads so easily. It's not just that people are weak. It's also because beings who hate creation are always attacking. The Ethiopian vision sees this conflict as the backdrop of history, with wars, empires, and even cultural movements as signs of deeper battles going on in the unseen realm. What kings and rulers decide on earth is like the whispers of angels or demons telling them what to do. People need to figure out whose voice they should listen to. Ethiopia keeps a picture of the universe as a battlefield in these writings, where the fate of humanity is tied to the fights between angels and demons. It is a call to be aware, to be on guard, and to have faith, reminding readers that everything they face has spiritual weight. Behind every test, temptation, or victory is the sound of that old war, which started with the Watchers' rebellion and will end with the final judgment, when light will win once and for all. Until that day, humanity is at the center of the fight, told to fight against the darkness and join the armies of heaven. The Ethiopian version of the story of Noah and the ancient flood is much more complex and disturbing than the simple one that has been told in Western cultures for a long time. It starts out pretty much like you'd expect. Humanity's corruption has reached its breaking point. The Watchers came down, married women from among men, and their children, the giants, have brought violence to the world. The Nephilim were huge beings that ate both the food of men and the lifeblood of creation itself, leaving destruction in their wake. In response, the Most High passes judgment and says that the earth must be cleansed with water. He then chooses Noah to build the vessel of salvation. The Western canon ends its story of the giants with the floodwaters. But the Ethiopian traditions go further and ask the troubling question: if the Nephilim were wiped out, why do their shadows still linger in human history? Ethiopian manuscripts say that Noah was not only a good person, but also a key figure in a cosmic war. He was not only saving his family and the animal kingdom, he was also protecting the order of creation from corruption. The ark is more than just wood and pitch. It is a fortress that God protects. It is sealed off from the waters and the evil spirits that were raging as the floodwaters rose. People said that the archangels helped Noah by tying up the spirits of the worst offenders so that the ark wouldn't be destroyed by the anger of the fallen. The rain started, the deep fountains burst open, and people were swept away. The Ethiopian view, on the other hand, says that not all of the giants died, which changes how the flood is understood. One explanation that is still around in these writings says that some of the giants lived on through their spirits, even though their bodies were destroyed. These beings, who were born of heaven and earth but didn't belong to either, didn't get any peace in death. Instead, their souls became disembodied demons that wandered the world, cursed with never-ending hunger that they could never satisfy. They became problems for people, causing violence, lust, and hopelessness in the years after the flood. So even though Noah's Ark brought people into a world that was clean, the fact that these Nephilim spirits were still around meant that the fight between good and evil didn't stop. This belief elucidates the persistence of demonic forces, the unending nature of temptation, and humanity's continued experience of being haunted by remnants of a past that ought to have been submerged. But there are even more disturbing stories in Ethiopian culture that say that some giants lived through the flood. Some writings talk about how a remnant was able to avoid destruction by holding onto mountains, finding hidden places to hide, or being spared for reasons known only to heaven. In one story, Og, a giant who is remembered in later biblical texts, survived by holding onto the ark itself and riding out the floodwaters by holding onto its timbers while Noah and his sons watched in fear. Some versions say that Noah's wife or one of the sons' wives had a trace of the Nephilim bloodline in her, which made sure that the corrupted seed made it to the new world. These differences are troubling because they suggest that the world after the flood wasn't as pure as people thought, and that the giants' corruption lasted long after the waters went down. The survival of the giants is more than just a curiosity. It has deep effects on human history. If some of the Nephilim survived, the emergence of subsequent tyrants, monarchs, and empires assumes a more sinister significance. Ethiopian texts indicate that the persistent existence of giants elucidates why, generations subsequent to the flood, Israel encountered the Anakim, Rephaim, and other giant races in Canaan. The spies sent by Moses were scared of the tall figures, which were not new creations, but remnants of an old corruption that refused to die. Their survival linked the days of Noah to the struggles of Israel, creating a story of continuity that Western traditions often end too soon. The Ethiopian view goes even further, suggesting that the Nephilim's survival affected not only ancient nations, but also the course of civilizations. The building of megalithic structures, the rise of cruel empires, and the spread of occult practices can all be traced back to the lasting effects of giants and their spirits. People remember these beings not just because of how big they were, but also because of the forbidden knowledge they had, the teachings of war, magic, astrology, and charms that the Watchers had given them. Even after the flood, bits of this knowledge came back, brought by the survivors, and whispered into the ears of kings and rulers. So the evil that existed before the flood wasn't wiped out. It was moved to the roots of human civilization. Monks who lived in monasteries in Ethiopia's highlands studied these texts and talked about the giants as a way to explain the world's problems. The wars, oppression, and unfairness that have happened throughout history weren't just caused by human greed. They were also caused by an ancient being that survived the flood. These monks wrote that to understand the story of humanity, one had to accept that the great purge of Noah's time was not finished, and that the fight against corruption was still going on in small, sneaky ways. The demons that haunted villages, the visions of giants that were passed down through oral traditions, and the fact that violent empires still exist, all show that the Nephilim were not wiped out, but instead changed to fit into a new world. This is how the Ethiopian version of the flood makes it hard for people to believe that evil was once gotten rid of and will never come back. Instead, it calls for a more watchful attitude. The giants, whether in spirit or flesh, were still part of being human. They became rulers, oppressors, and sometimes even the people who built great things on pride and bloodshed. The fact that they are still alive is also why prophecy keeps warning of end-time wars, when pieces of that old evil rise up to fight the forces of heaven. These customs make me think of scary things. If any Nephilim blood or influence remains, humanity possesses a legacy of both celestial and insurrectionary origins. The Ethiopian texts suggest that this blend affects the decisions people make, the societies they create, and the wars they fight. So the flood was not only a story of destruction, but also a turning point in history, a time when people were given a second chance but also a burden to bear, knowing that the old corruption was still there. The ark brought life to the new world, but shadows from the old world clung to its edges, saying that the fight was far from over. The Ethiopian scriptures make us face a version of the flood that doesn't end with a promise of peace, but instead leaves humanity with an unfinished story. They say that the world we live in today is still shaped by what survived the waters. They say that the giant's legacy lives on in ways that are not always obvious, affecting the paths of nations and the lives of individuals. In this version, Noah's flood didn't kill the giants. It was the start of a long fight for humans against their continued presence. The ancient texts of Ethiopia tell the story of the Watchers, including their fall and the terrible things they did by sharing secrets with people. These weren't just lessons about farming or finding shelter. They were lessons that went to the heart of creation. The Watchers came from heaven with knowledge that people were never meant to have. This knowledge would change the balance of life and bring destruction all over the world. They showed people the hidden sciences, from making weapons to the secrets of the stars, and in doing so, they ruined whole generations. This was the start of forbidden knowledge, and its effects are still felt today. The first lesson was how to fight. Men have always used stone and wood to hunt and stay alive. But the Watchers showed them how to get metals from the ground, shape them with fire, and sharpen them into deadly weapons. Bronze and iron were no longer signs of progress. They were now signs of death. Early tribes didn't know about swords, shields, and spears, but they became the currency of power. These weapons allowed the strong to enslave the weak, and violence became a part of everyday life. People stopped trusting in the balance of nature and the divine order, and instead relied on conquest and domination. The Watchers had planted the seed of never-ending war, a curse that has been heard on every battlefield in history, but what they taught went beyond just weapons. They also told people about the secrets of magic and spells. These were arts that could bend spiritual forces to the will of people, but they came at a terrible cost. People started to call on unseen forces and make spells and charms that made it hard to tell the difference between prayer and rebellion. Women learned how to use herbs and mixtures, not to heal, but to seduce, curse, and control people. Men were taught how to call on spirits, write spells, and control forces they couldn't. By doing these things, people got involved with demons and opened doors to places that should never have been crossed. The Watchers, who had already broken their vows to God, now made people help them break the rules of heaven. Astrology taught people how to corrupt even the heavens themselves. The stars, which used to be silent lights that guided shepherds and sailors, became codes and symbols of hidden power. The Watchers taught men how to read the stars and how to use their movements as signs of fate. People stopped trusting in the Creator's will and started trusting in the stars' alignment. They looked to the heavens for guidance instead of divine command. Kings came to power who said they got their power from the stars instead of doing the right thing, and empires planned their wars and sacrifices based on what the stars said. What was made to be beautiful and amazing was turned into a way to control people, making them believe in superstitions. In these forbidden sciences, people thought they were gaining power when they were really losing their innocence. People quickly passed on the information from father to son and from teacher to student. What started as a few new ideas grew into whole traditions of astrology, magic, and war. Even though the flood came to wash away the bad things, some pieces of this knowledge stayed. It kept growing in secret places thanks to people who wouldn't let it die. The Watchers' teachings were still visible in the world after Noah. This same forbidden knowledge, which mixed the sword with sorcery and the stars with sacrifice, was often the reason why great empires like Babylon, Egypt, and Assyria rose. This knowledge was dangerous not only because it could destroy things, but also because it could pull people away from God. Men put their faith in strength when they had weapons. They believed in demons through magic. They believed in the stars through astrology. All of it took their hearts away from heaven and tied them to the ground. This is why, hundreds of years later, the prophets of Israel spoke out against divination, magic, and looking at the stars. They knew that these things weren't just innocent interests. They were echoes of the rebellion that started with the Watchers. When Isaiah condemned those who consulted the heavens instead of God, or when Moses forbade enchantments and necromancy, they were attacking the roots of this old evil. The Ethiopian texts show how seriously heaven took these wrongdoings. The archangels were told to do something, which meant tying up the Watchers' leaders, chaining them in darkness, and judging them. Their punishment was harsh, because what they did hurt all of creation. Not only did they disobey, but they also gave people the means to destroy themselves. Still, their teachings were strong. Even though the Watchers were in prison, their knowledge stayed with people like a bad virus. There are signs of its influence in every age of human history, such as violent empires, occult traditions, and the obsession with horoscopes and predictions. Why then? Was this information hidden and called forbidden truth? Because it was never meant for people to use. The Watchers' secrets gave people quick ways to get power, but they took away their connection to the divine. The path of forbidden knowledge promised power, speed, and control, while the path of righteousness required trust, patience, and humility. It was tempting and spread quickly, but it also brought death with it. The priests and elders who kept the Ethiopian canon knew how dangerous this was. They kept the memory of how and why this corruption came into the world alive by including the Book of Enoch and other writings. Western leaders, on the other hand, tried to keep these stories from getting out because they were afraid that people would want to learn more about the Watchers' teachings. The suppression was also based on politics. Empires that thrived on power and domination didn't care much about reminding people that these kinds of things came from rebelling against heaven. If astrology was used to make kings and iron weapons were used to keep empires together, then admitting that they came from forbidden knowledge would show that their foundations were rotten. The safest thing to do was to say that these texts were not good enough to read, bury them under councils and canons, and give people a shorter Bible that left out uncomfortable truths. Ethiopia, on the other hand, would not accept this change. They kept all 88 books so that people could remember how heaven's order was broken and why they shouldn't make the same mistakes again. The Watchers' teachings still have an effect today. Astrology is all over the news and the internet, convincing millions of people to base their lives on the stars. Every generation makes war weapons better, but they still teach the same lesson that was first given in secret. People who want power beyond the natural world are still drawn to occult practices that use new language. What started before the flood has never really left the earth. The forbidden knowledge is still there, but it has been changed and given a new name. It is still dangerous. In the quiet of Ethiopian monasteries, monks used to say that the biggest test of humanity was not ignorance, but the desire to know more. To learn too much too soon, without being old enough to use it, was to let destruction in. The Watchers had given people fruit from a tree that was not allowed, and people had eagerly taken it. The price was not just the flood, but also hundreds of years of fighting as men kept trying to use powers they were never meant to have. The forbidden truth is that people have always been haunted by knowledge they should never have had. And every empire that rose and fell on that foundation carried the curse of the Watchers with it. There is a very interesting story that links the history of Israel to the future of Africa. It is hidden beneath the shifting sands of time. The story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba is not only a biblical story, but it is also an important part of Ethiopia's national identity and spiritual foundation. The stories about their meeting are full of mystery, power, and prophecy, mixing politics, divine wisdom, and sacred objects that would change the fate of nations. The Ark of the Covenant, Israel's most sacred relic, is at the center of this story. Ethiopia boldly claims to have kept it safe for hundreds of years. It is not just a story about old kings. It's also a story about how Ethiopia became a living keeper of biblical memory when other countries let go of parts of this holy puzzle. In Ethiopian tradition, the Queen of Sheba was called Makeda. She was not just any ruler. She ruled over a huge and rich kingdom in the south, with fertile land, trade routes and wealth that was as great as that of the empires in the north. She had to see for herself if the stories about King Solomon's wisdom and divine favor were true when they reached her court. This choice was not made out of curiosity alone. It was based on a deep understanding that spiritual authority is just as important as political power. The Kebra Nagast and other Ethiopian texts tell the story of Makeda's long and dangerous journey to Jerusalem, during which she brought Solomon expensive gifts and asked him questions that only a divinely inspired mind could answer. It wasn't just a diplomatic meeting between Solomon and Sheba. It was a symbolic union between Israel and Africa, a joining of spiritual paths that would have effects for many years to come. The Ethiopian story doesn't just show Solomon as a wise king. It also shows him as a king whose wisdom was based on God's law and order in heaven. The queen was amazed by how well he could tell the truth, rule fairly, and figure out mysteries. She found not only answers in him, but also a reflection of divine authority that spoke to her spirit. This meeting would change Ethiopia's story forever. Ethiopian tradition says that the relationship between Solomon and Sheba went beyond just talking. It led to the birth of a son, Menelik the Phil, who would later return to Jerusalem as a young man. Menelik's journey is one of the most exciting parts of Ethiopian history because it was during his time in Israel that a divine mystery happened. The stories say that when Menelik was getting ready to go back to Ethiopia, God let the Ark of the Covenant, the holy chest that held the tablets of the 10 Commandments, the rod of Aaron and other holy things, go with him. Some people say that Solomon himself gave his blessing, while others say that the priests and angels made sure it got to Ethiopia, which was part of a bigger plan to make Africa the protector of the covenant when Israel failed. One of the most controversial and lasting parts of Ethiopia's spiritual heritage is the claim that the Ark is in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church says that the Ark is in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum, where it is protected by a single monk whose job it is to keep it safe. The Ethiopian people have faith in this tradition, even though no one else is allowed to see it. The Ark is not a myth or an old thing for them. It's a living sign of God's promise and presence in their land. This belief makes Ethiopia a holy place and a chosen keeper of divine truth at a time when many other countries changed or gave up their spiritual roots. The meeting between Solomon and Sheba, which took place outside of the Ark, also stands for a transfer of knowledge and law. According to Ethiopian tradition, Solomon taught Israel not only how to run a country and how to be spiritual, but also the rules of divine order that governed the country. These teachings were kept and changed in Ethiopia, where they became the basis for the monarchy and religious life for hundreds of years. Ethiopian kings said they were related to both Solomon and Sheba, and they could trace their family tree back to Menelik I. This made their power more holy than that of most ancient rulers. The Ethiopian version of this story is very different from the Western versions. The Queen of Sheba is an interesting but secondary character in most Western stories. She is a foreign queen who is impressed by Solomon's wisdom and then fades into history. But Ethiopia sees her as a key mother figure, the head of a dynasty that brought God's authority to Africa. She is not just a visitor. She is the vessel through which the covenant entered Ethiopia. This made sure that Africa became part of God's plan in a way that the Western canon often misses. The Ark's presence in Ethiopia also had a spiritual effect that affected both faith and the country's strength. Ethiopians thought that the Ark's presence would protect them during invasions, plagues, and trials. The Ethiopian Church's rituals and liturgies show this deep connection. For example, Timkat, Epiphany, is a celebration where people carry tablets, which are copies of the Ark, in processions. These rituals strengthen the idea that Ethiopia's connection to the covenant is not just a theory, but something that is happening, shaping the rhythm of spiritual and community life. Ethiopia's claim to the Ark has effects that go beyond its own borders. If this is true, it means that one of the most sacred objects in biblical history was taken from Israel and given to Africa, changing the story of divine stewardship. It puts Africa at the center of salvation history instead of on the edge, which goes against the Western story that sees Africa as only on the edge. Ethiopia's role is not only that of a pious nation, but also as a selected custodian of divine enigmas. This change in perspective shakes up old ideas and makes us rethink how history has been told and by whom. The Ethiopian tradition of preserving Solomon's wisdom reinforces this idea even more. Ethiopian texts talk about more than just his riddles and judgments. They also talk about his spiritual insights that linked heaven and earth. Solomon's proverbs and songs, which are very important to Ethiopia's religious culture, became rules for everyone, from kings to priests to regular people. Ethiopia didn't just get a relic, it took in a living tradition that changed its culture, government, and religion. The legacy of Solomon and Sheba is still felt all over Ethiopia today. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church still recognizes their importance, and the monarchy that lasted until the 20th century traced its divine authority back to them. People come to Axum to be close to the Ark, while scholars and seekers argue about the secrets that Ethiopian manuscripts hold. The story lives on not just as history, but also as a strong story about identity, strength, and duty. The story of Solomon, Sheba, and the Ark of the Covenant is more than just a story. It says that Africa is not an outsider to the Bible story, but rather a place where the story's deepest treasures are kept. Ethiopia's unbroken connection to this tradition shows the world that divine wisdom is not limited to one place or one group of people, but rather flows where it is meant to be kept. The claim may still be a mystery, but its strength comes from the faith of a nation that has held on to this truth for thousands of years. The tale of the forbidden scriptures is inextricably linked to the political decisions that determined which divine voices would be amplified and which would be muted. In the 4th century, the leaders of the Western Church met at the Council of Nicaea, which was held in the shadow of the empire. The Roman Emperor Constantine wanted Christians to be united, not different. He wanted to unite the empire with one doctrine, one creed, and one official scripture. The outcome of this council was not a purely spiritual determination, but a political concession. Texts that made people uncomfortable, questioned authority, or changed how people thought about their relationship with God were either left out or outright condemned. The end result was a Bible that was not just a collection of divine revelations, but a carefully chosen book of empire that was cut and shaped to serve both political control and spiritual truth, the books that lived on in Ethiopia but were lost from the Western canon were some of the people who died in this process. People thought that the book of Enoch, Jubilees, Baruch, and the Maccabees were dangerous, not needed, or wrong. These were not innocuous omissions. They were intentional dismissals of narratives concerning angelic insurrections, giant malfeasance, prophecies of African kingdoms' ascendance, or calendars that contested Roman supremacy. The Western Church chose to be quiet instead of revealing things, to leave people out instead of letting them in, and in doing so, they changed Christianity into a faith that fit the needs of the empire instead of the full range of divine wisdom. Ethiopia, on the other hand, took a different path. The Ethiopian Church kept its faith alive by using its own language, culture, and sacred traditions, far away from the politics of Rome. Ethiopia kept what the West threw away. Ethiopia remembered when the West stopped talking. The Ethiopian canon of 88 books is not just another Bible. It's a living record of truths that the rest of the world was not allowed to see. By keeping texts like Enoch and Jubilees, Ethiopia made sure that the cosmic drama of angels and demons, the different version of creation, and Africa's own deep spiritual role would not be lost from the story of humanity. Ethiopia became a protector of both scripture and hidden history in this way. This difference between canons changes how we think about Christianity as a whole. In the West, the Bible often seems like a story that goes from beginning to end, with a fall and a redemption in between. But in Ethiopia's canon, the story is deeper, wider, and full of mysteries that make humanity's place in the universe bigger. Angels are not far-off messengers. They are involved in a fight that affects the earth. Giants are not just stories. They were real people whose effects lasted for generations. Prophecies are not vague symbols. They are clear messages that point to Africa as a chosen land. Time is not random. It follows divine cycles that people have often forgotten. These layers don't make Christianity weaker. They make it stronger by reminding us that the kingdom of God was never meant to be limited by empire or made easier for politicians. Africa plays a very important role in this story. For hundreds of years, Western stories have portrayed Africa as a place on the edge of history where outsiders to the biblical drama lived. But the Ethiopian scriptures show the opposite. Africa was not on the outside, but on the inside, not on the edge, but in the center. The Queen of Sheba stood in front of Solomon, and their son took the covenant to Ethiopia. Prophecy said that a kingdom would rise from the south, a place chosen to protect divine truth when others turned away from it. Jesus himself spent his childhood in Africa, where he learned and grew in places that Western texts hardly mention. To acknowledge these truths is to revise the narrative of salvation history, positioning Africa not in obscurity, but in the illumination of divine intent. So, why does this matter now? Because history is still being rewritten, and the truth is still being hidden. The same powers that once chose empire over revelation are still shaping how we see the world. People are still left out of history. Knowledge is still censored, and voices that are not helpful are still silenced. The Ethiopian Bible is a challenge to this cycle. It reminds us that what is thought to be forbidden can often lead to freedom. By finding these lost books again, we are not just finding old stories. We are also getting back a bigger, better and fairer view of humanity. The Book of Enoch talks about heavenly realms and cosmic battles that remind us we are more than just our bodies. Jubilees talks about holy time and tells us to live in harmony with the rhythms of the divine. The prophecies about kingdoms rising in Africa remind us that God's plan includes all nations, not just those that ruled over empires. If you don't listen to these voices, you are accepting a half-truth, a broken picture of reality. To accept them means realizing that the story of God and people is much bigger than we were told. It is not by chance that Ethiopia is the guardian of these truths. It is by design. Ethiopia wanted to stay safe, while Rome wanted to take over. When Europe built cathedrals of empire, Ethiopia built monasteries to remember. The Western Church cut down the tree of Scripture to fit a small box, but Ethiopia took care of the whole forest, roots and all. That preservation is more important than ever now, because in a time of confusion, division, and questions about identity, the whole truth is what heals. The West's refusal to accept these texts was not only about doctrine, but also about power. A book that says angels told people about forbidden sciences is a threat to those who say they have all the power. A prophecy of Africa rising goes against Europe's power. A tale of giants enduring the flood disrupts the narrative of human purity. These stories were not easy to hear, so they were silenced. But by silencing them, the West took away the truths that could have changed history. To find them again now is to bring things back into balance. It is to hear the voices of prophets and scribes who spoke to generations long before the empire, reminding us that the story of humanity is connected to the heavens, creation, and lands far beyond Rome. You need to understand that what people called forbidden is often the most true, the most freeing and the most dangerous to those in power. This is why it matters now. The story of the forbidden scriptures is not only historical, it is contemporary. It's about getting back voices that the empire tried to silence. It is about seeing Africa as a place where God has worked in history. It's about seeing people not as groups of people who live in different places or empires, but as a family connected by a deeper, hidden truth. So, the last revelation is this. What the West turned down was not just scripture, but the very basis of human history. These texts are not just bits of old stories. They are living proof of who we are, where we came from, and what shapes our world. If you ignore them, you won't see half of our story. To accept them is to enter the fullness of truth. This is more than just scripture. It's the secret history of all people. What if the oldest Bible in the world contained truths that could change everything you thought you knew about history, faith, and humanity? What if a set of scriptures hidden away for centuries in the mountains of Africa told a story that was never meant for your eyes, or at least not meant for the world as it has been shaped today? That's not just a riddle or a dramatic opening line. It's a reality, because the Ethiopian Bible, the oldest complete Christian Bible on earth, does exactly that. It dares to tell stories that challenge what many people think they know, and it raises questions that most religious institutions would prefer never to answer. Ethiopia is more than just a country in East Africa. It is a land whose roots run deeper than many realize, a nation that has carried secrets of the ancient world while empires rose and fell around it. And within its churches, its monasteries, and its centuries of tradition, Ethiopia has guarded something the rest of the world either forgot or deliberately ignored. While Western Europe built its version of Christianity, carefully edited and reshaped to suit the politics of the time, Ethiopia quietly preserved an older tradition, a canon of texts so vast and so bold that it holds 88 books compared to the 66 most of the world knows today. Think about that. 22 extra books, filled with stories that never made it into the Western Bible. Some of them explain the missing years of Jesus. Others tell us about fallen angels, giants, visions of the end times, and the struggle between good and evil in ways that are far sharper, far darker, and far more revealing than anything you've been told in Sunday school. These are not just add-ons. They are scriptures that could reshape how you see creation itself, how you see humanity's role on earth, and how you see the forces that have been battling for control of our world since the beginning of time. Why were these books set aside? Why was Ethiopia left to hold on to them, while the rest of the world was told a smaller, narrower version of the story? Was it a matter of control, of power, of hiding truths too dangerous to be shared? Or was it simply that Ethiopia's Christianity grew separate, untouched by the Roman Empire and its later councils that decided what was acceptable and what would be burned or banned? Whatever the answer, the result is this. The Ethiopian Bible is a time capsule, a window into a faith unedited, unsanitized, and unashamed of the mysteries that the Western world tried to bury. But let me ask you something. Why does this matter today? Why does it matter in an age where most people barely open the 66 books, let alone the 88? The answer is simple. We live in a world where truth is constantly being twisted, rewritten, or silenced. Our history books are edited, our media filters what we see, and for thousands of years, even our scriptures have been touched by the same hand. That's why looking back at the Ethiopian Bible is not just about the past. It's about the present. It's about asking what truths are still being hidden from us now, and who benefits when we stay in the dark. You see, the moment you begin reading the Ethiopian Bible, you realize it feels alive in a different way. It is filled with stories that don't just echo the familiar, they expand them. It speaks of Adam and Eve in ways that highlight the cosmic battle that began with their fall. It reveals a Jesus who is far more radical, far more connected to the oppressed and far more divine than many modern sermons dare to say. It keeps alive books like Enoch, which describe the rebellion of angels, the birth of giants, and the corruption of humanity in vivid detail. These aren't fairy tales. They're warnings, preserved in a book that refused to bow to the erasers of history. And that's what makes Ethiopia's role so extraordinary. While nations chased wealth, conquest, and empire, Ethiopia was building monasteries in caves, where monks dedicated their lives to copying these texts by hand, preserving them word for word across centuries. Imagine the patience, the sacrifice, the devotion it takes to protect something for nearly 2,000 years. That is why the Ethiopian Bible exists today in a form no one else can claim. It is the oldest complete Bible in the world, and it has stood untouched through wars, colonization, and centuries of silence from the West. But silence can only last so long. Today, these scriptures are reaching more eyes and ears than ever before, and for some, that is terrifying. Because once you start reading them, once you hear the voice of these ancient pages, you realize just how much has been kept from you. You begin to see that the Bible you were raised on, while powerful in its own right, is not the whole story. It's only a piece of the puzzle. And the Ethiopian Bible is the missing piece that makes the picture complete. Now imagine how different the world could look if these texts were not hidden. If the Book of Enoch, with its detailed description of angels who fell and corrupted humanity, had been part of the Western Bible from the start. Imagine if the lost years of Jesus, described in these texts, had been openly taught for centuries. Imagine if people had known from the beginning that their faith was never meant to be a weapon of empire, but a living fire meant to set people free. The thought alone is powerful. And maybe, just maybe, it's dangerous to those who prefer a tame faith, a faith that doesn't question, a faith that doesn't empower. That's why this story matters. That's why this documentary matters, because once you hear what the Ethiopian Bible contains, you cannot unhear it. Once you know, you cannot go back to not knowing. And that's the very definition of forbidden truth, knowledge so powerful that the world tries to hide it. But now it's in your hands. And the question is, what will you do with it? Before we move deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it right now? Drop your name and your city in the comments. I want to know how far this truth is reaching tonight. And if you're as hungry for knowledge as I am, then I need you to do two things. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone you know. Together we can grow this community to 10,000 subscribers and beyond. If you want to support the channel directly, hit the super thanks button. It helps keep this work alive. And if you want the complete 88 Books Ethiopian Bible and the Book of Enoch in English, I've put the link in the description. Go get it for yourself, because nothing is more powerful than reading the truth with your own eyes. The Land Under. The hot sun of the Horn of Africa has a story that goes deeper than the dirt under its mountains. Ethiopia is more than just another country on the map of East Africa. It is a living archive of the world's oldest faith traditions and a protector of treasures that most people have long since forgotten. Ethiopia stayed strong for hundreds of years, even as empires rose and fell and conquerors tried to change history. It carried with it a legacy of faith that would not bend to outside forces. That strength and resilience is why Ethiopia is the only country in the world that still has all 88 books of the ancient Bible. Christianity did not come to Ethiopia through war, and foreign armies did not force it on the people. The Aksumite Empire, which lasted from the 1st century onward, was when it first took root. Aksum was a big deal. It was one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world, controlling trade routes across the Red Sea and having as much power as Rome, Persia, and India. Its coins, which have crosses on them, are proof of a time when faith and power came together to make one of the first Christian states. But what made Aksum stand out was not just that it accepted Christianity, but that it did so on its own terms, without Rome's help. The story starts with a man named Frumentius, who is often thought of as Ethiopia's apostle. He was taken as a child and brought to Aksum, where he worked his way up in the royal court and eventually converted the king of the empire, Ezana, to Christianity. Ethiopia's conversion to Christianity was different from many others in history that were forced by war and bloodshed. It was based on choice and conviction. The Aksumite Empire became one of the first kingdoms in the world to officially declare Christianity as its religion at that point. What came next was more than just a new chapter in faith. It was the start of a cultural identity that would last through invasions, wars, and hundreds of years of being cut off from the rest of the world. During these early years, Ethiopia started gathering and keeping the scriptures that would later make up the Ethiopian Bible. While Rome held councils to decide what should be kept and what should be thrown away, Ethiopia took in and protected writings that others had thrown away. Here is where the Book of Enoch, the Jubilees, and other writings that built on Genesis and the Gospels found a permanent home. Ethiopian monks and scribes did not think they were dangerous or wrong. They thought they were true, worth copying, worth teaching, and worth protecting at all costs. Ethiopia's ancient monasteries were safe places for these manuscripts because they were high in the mountains and hidden in caves. Monks spent their whole lives copying texts by hand, using parchment made from animal skins and inks made from natural minerals. Every stroke of the pen was a prayer, and every page was a gift. Some monasteries, like the ones in the remote area of Tigray, are built into steep cliffs, so getting to the entrance is a dangerous climb. But the fact that it is so hard to get to is what makes Ethiopian preservation so smart. The monks protected their scriptures from the fires of war and the eyes of foreign invaders by hiding their treasures in places that were hard to get to understand why Ethiopia was the only country to keep all 88 books. You need to look at its geography and its desire to stay free. Ethiopia was hard to conquer because it was between strong neighbors and had rough terrain. It was not colonized until the short Italian occupation in the 20th century, which was different from most of Africa. Even then, its culture and faith stayed the same. Ethiopia's isolation protected it for hundreds of years. The Western Church was busy with political councils, theological arguments, and imperial orders that limited the Bible to 66 books. Meanwhile, Ethiopia quietly worked on a more complete canon. Another important reason is how Ethiopians think about faith itself. They didn't see the Bible as just a way to run the country or a book to be cut down for convenience. It was sacred history. The story of how God and people have been together since the beginning of time. It was too big and too deep for people to change. Ethiopia kept stories alive that would have been lost forever if they had given up any of the writings. The fallen angels of Enoch, the details of creation found in Jubilees, the wisdom of other psalms and prayers, these were all still a part of Ethiopian life, woven into their art, their liturgy, and their sense of who they were. The monasteries weren't just places to store books. They were also places to keep memories safe. For example, Debre de Mo is on a flat-topped mountain that can only be reached by climbing a leather rope up a steep cliff. This monastery kept manuscripts safe from outside hands for hundreds of years, through invasions and the passage of time. Or think about the churches in Lalibela, which were carved right out of solid rock. To this day, priests chant scriptures that most people have never heard. The Bible's forgotten books were not relics in these holy places. They were living texts that guided worship and shaped belief. It's also important to remember that Ethiopia's Jewish roots helped keep this alive. Ethiopia had a community of Jewish believers before Christianity got there. This is sometimes linked to the story of the Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon. Ethiopia had long valued Hebrew traditions and writings because of this old connection. When Christianity came, it was not a break but a continuation. Other Christian groups didn't like these books because they were too Jewish, but they were accepted here as part of the whole story. The Ethiopian canon is unique because it combines ancient Israelite and early Christian traditions. Ethiopia's independence from Western control also meant that it was never forced to follow the canon rules set by councils like Nicaea or Trent. No emperor's decree could dictate which books should be read or which should be destroyed. Instead, Ethiopian monks trusted their traditions, their teachers, and the wisdom passed down through centuries. That freedom gave them the strength to protect what others were afraid of. As time went on, this preservation became more than just a matter of faith. It became a source of national pride. The Ethiopian Bible is written in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language that has been kept alive by priests and scholars long after it stopped being spoken in daily life. In many ways, the survival of the language mirrors the survival of the scriptures themselves. They were both kept not because it was easy to do so, but because they were worth it. For generations, Ethiopians thought of themselves as the guardians of a trust that had been passed down from their ancestors. This trust linked them directly to the first followers of Christ. To this day, if you travel through Ethiopia, you can find churches that still hold manuscripts centuries old, wrapped in cloth and carried out only for special occasions. You can meet priests who have memorized large parts of the 88 books and can recite them with the same rhythm that their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. You can stand inside monasteries where candlelight still flickers across pages written on animal skin. The ink is as dark as it was when it was first put down. These aren't things you see in museums. They are living proof that a country never forgot its duty to protect hidden scriptures. Ethiopia's story as the guardian of the ancient Bible is not an accident of history. It is the result of a conscious decision of sacrifice and of unwavering faith. The Aksumite Empire might have been able to handle the pressure from other countries. When wars came to their doors, the monasteries could have stopped working. The scribes could have chosen an easier life than spending decades hunched over parchment. But they didn't. And since they didn't, people can still read the Bible as it was, with all the truths that others tried to hide. When people think of the Bible, they usually think of the 66 books that make up Western Christianity, which are neatly bound together in the same way that many other books are. For hundreds of years, though, there was a much larger collection of writings. These texts shaped the first believers and told stories of angels and giants, visions and divine wisdom, wars fought in heaven, and struggles endured on earth. Councils and church leaders later said that many of these books were dangerous, heretical, or not needed, and the pages were cut out of the Western canon. But they lived on in Ethiopia. Some of these are the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, Baruch, Tobit, Maccabees, and many others that the rest of the world forgot, but that Ethiopian priests and scribes never forgot. The Book of Enoch is a great example of this split. It's quoted in the New Testament letter of Jude and was well known among the first Christians. It has visions of heavenly realms, descriptions of angelic beings, and the story of the Watchers, angels who came to earth, married human women, and had the Nephilim, a race of giants. This story builds on the strange verses in Genesis that hint at things like this happening. It gives voice to a tradition that explains where evil and corruption come from on earth. For early believers, Enoch was not a story of fantasy, but a revelation of spiritual warfare. But as the years went by, church leaders in the West became less comfortable with its detailed accounts of fallen angels and otherworldly beings. If it were true, it would make people question human history and divine judgment, which would go against the neat order that the councils wanted to create. So Enoch was quiet in the West, but in Ethiopia, it was still a key part of faith. The Ethiopian tradition also holds the Book of Jubilees in high regard.